Okay, well, thanks for that wonderful introduction and some good coverage of some of the technologies and some of the big trends that are changing the world. And I think a lot of those that were just discussed are part of this new era that we're entering into, often characterized as the second digital age. So to give you a bit of background on the evolution of technology, the first digital age brought us the computer, the original computer. And from there created this explosion of new technologies, the mainframe, the mini computer, the PC, the internet, the smartphone, and the mobile web. And now we're in this period where technology is ubiquitous. It's part of our daily lives, it's part of every business, and it's deeply ingrained in society. And there are many new technologies that make up this second digital age. Of course, augmented reality, machine learning, artificial intelligence, technology in our bodies, clean tech, robotics. But there's actually one technology specifically that is going to have, I think, a greater impact than many of these others, and is actually going to help to animate many of these new technologies. And it's the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. So just a quick show of hands here, who's heard of blockchain before? And who understands it very well? So a few of you, okay. So it's my hope that you'll come out of this today and reflect on this talk in a way that you may reflect on a talk you heard 20 years ago about the first era of the internet, because blockchain represents the second era. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, unique thing. You're sending a copy, and you're retaining an original. So let's think of some use cases. If you send an email to one person, you can send the same email to someone else or many other people. If you host a website, it's available for all to see. If you put an entry into Wikipedia or on Twitter, it's available for everyone to look at and to scrutinize. So in many ways, it's kind of like the internet gave every individual its own printing press for information. And that's an amazingly powerful tool, and overall had a pretty positive impact on the world. Except when it comes to things that have value, assets like money or stocks, being able to send copies is actually a terrible idea. So if you owe someone $20 for something and you send it to them, it's very important that they know when they receive it that they have the only version of that $20, and you can't send the same $20 to someone else. Or if you have a share in a company and you sell that share to someone, it's really important you can't sell it over and over again, because of course at that point that asset becomes worthless. So it's great to have a printing press for information. It's not so great to have a printing press for money or for assets. And this is a very specific computer science problem that people have been trying to figure out for the better part of 2 decades. It's called the double spend problem. How do you ensure that when you move something of value digitally, that you aren't leaving behind a copy? And because it's such a difficult problem to solve, even though the internet has, broadly speaking, created lots of value, a lot of that has been captured asymmetrically by intermediaries. So of course the intermediaries that people would be familiar with would be middlemen like banks and governments and brokers. But increasingly, as more and more commerce and more communication moves online, the biggest intermediaries today are actually digital conglomerates like Google and Amazon, or big social media companies like Facebook. And overall, these intermediaries do an okay job, except they have some very specific limitations. The first is that they're all centralized, and anything that's centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack or to fraud, and this happens regularly in every single industry. The second big issue is that they capture a lot of value and they slow things down. So in the case of sending money overseas, for example, it can take days and cost 10% to move money between two people on opposite sides of a border, which is sort of an odd concept. We talk about the market for cross-border payments and assume that it is what it is. But nobody ever says, I'm sending a cross-border email, or I'm sending a cross-border text message, or I'm doing a cross-border web search. So information flows like water all around the world. It's instant, except value takes time and costs a lot of money for the individuals who are sending it. The third big issue is that they exclude big parts of the population. So there are still billions of people in the world who don't have access to financial services, for example. And that's problematic because it keeps them trapped in the informal economy where they can't move up the income ladder. And then the fourth issue, and I think arguably the most pressing today, and you're going to hear from an excellent speaker this afternoon named Chris Wiley, is the aggregation of data. So intermediaries capture all this data. Every time you interact with them, they are consuming information about you. And that's problematic because we can't use that data to organize our lives. We can't monetize it. It's worth something. and it could potentially be used to undermine our privacy. And obviously we've seen that actually play out time and time again with lots of intermediaries. Equifax, the Equifax hack. Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan have been hacked. Yahoo, LinkedIn have been hacked. And so all of a sudden, voluntarily or not, your data can end up in the hands of people that you don't want it. So what if the internet were entering a second era? From an internet of information to an internet of value based on this new technology called the blockchain. So basically, what the blockchain is a digital medium for value. It's a way for individuals to move and store and manage assets on the internet without the need for intermediaries like banks and brokers and big companies. And this all really started back in 2008, actually right around the time that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. An anonymous person or group of persons with the name Satoshi Nakamoto created this thing called Bitcoin. So who's heard of Bitcoin? Raise your hand. I'm just kidding, everyone's heard of Bitcoin. It's that thing that criminals use to buy drugs and guns on the internet. It is used for that, of course, but so is cash. No, Bitcoin was designed to do a very specific thing. It was designed to be basically cash for the internet. So this morning on my way to the conference center, I stopped at Starbucks and I bought a coffee and some sous vide bites, which are little protein bites, very good if you haven't tried them. I handed the clerk $10 and I got the goods and some change. At no point did they ask me for my driver's license. At no point did I use the Visa network. At no point did I share any information about myself, because cash is what's called a bearer instrument. Once you give it to someone, they have it, and you don't. You don't retain a copy of money once you give it to someone, right? So what Bitcoin was designed to do was basically to be cash for the internet, a digital bearer instrument that would allow you to pay for goods and services and move value online. And what was interesting about Bitcoin was that it worked. And it worked so well that it's set off this spark, which is clearly caught on like wildfire and captured the imagination of people in basically every single industry. But with all kinds of new technologies, everyone has a slightly different approach. So there's this old thing called the parable of the elephant, where basically there are a number of blind men and they're all standing around this elephant and they're all sort of touching a different part, right? So one person's touching the leg of the elephant and says it's the bark of a tree. The other one touches the tail and says it's a snake. Another one touches the ear and says it's a large leaf, it's a palm frond. So every single person has a different interpretation based on where they're standing and where they're looking at it. And I think that's the same thing with blockchain. Not everyone's convinced. Warren Buffett says that Bitcoin is probably rat poison squared, which I don't know how you square rat poison. Anybody who knows, let me know. I figure like once you've got rat poison, it's lethal enough. You don't need to square it. But anyway, we've seen this happen before, time in and time again. Whenever a new technology or a new phenomenon arises, that leaders of old paradigms have a hard time embracing the new. They treat it with derision, with humor, and obviously sometimes with hostility. More often than not, they're proven wrong. And I think the same thing will happen here. So one of the big fascinating areas of this technology that I think has caught a lot of people's attention is the rise of so-called crypto assets, basically these native digital assets. And to date, there are thousands of these things. And I think a lot of people rightly ask, why? Why are there thousands? Why should they be valuable? What's the point of any of these things? And it's all totally valid, and these are all very good questions. And the important thing to realize is that not all crypto assets are currencies. So currencies are a very specific kind of thing, right? A currency is a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account. But there are obviously lots of other kinds of assets in the world that have nothing to do with currencies. So currencies are actually only the very first category of 7 different types of crypto assets. So Bitcoin is obviously the biggest of the bunch, but there are also others like Monero, Zcash, Dash, and Bitcoin Cash that basically try to do something similar to what Bitcoin does, but with some improved functionality, either faster payment times or more anonymity or some other sort of feature. The second kind of category, and this is an area that's grown in value from basically nothing to being one of the biggest components of the whole ecosystem, are these platforms or these protocols. So Ethereum, which is one that I think many of you will be familiar with, is basically one of Canada's most successful startups ever. It was founded by a group of entrepreneurs in Toronto In 2014, they did one of the first ever token fundraising events, ICOs, if you've heard of them, and raised $18 million. Now, at the time, that was a lot of money, and it was about 8 times more than the next biggest crowdfunding campaign ever on sites like Indiegogo and Kickstarter. Of course, today it's very small in comparison to what we've seen. But basically, Ethereum pioneered this concept of the smart contract and of the distributed application. So basically, a smart contract is computer code that mimics the logic of a business agreement, but with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, where you don't need intermediaries to enforce the terms. So if you can think of basically any business, your business, the financial industry, almost every interaction between individuals involves some kind of a business agreement, some kind of a contract. So what if all contracts were self-executing and were automated in the same way that doing a web search was automated? That would change the nature of commerce pretty profoundly. And what Ethereum also pioneered was the ICO. So in 2015, the amount of money raised through ICOs was $9 million. In 2016, it was $165 million, which was mostly just one ICO for a thing called the DAO. In 2017, it was at least $3 billion and up to $6 billion, depending on who you ask. And through year-to-date 2018, it's over $10 billion. So the whole US venture capital market is $60 billion. Every year, $60 billion of money risk capital goes into ventures, right? So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this new, and in many ways, a superior form of fundraising has taken over big chunks of the venture capital world and has a lot of VCs on the back foot. And that's why Ethereum today is worth $22 billion, even despite the pullback that we've seen in crypto prices, because it's enabled this huge creation of new capital and the rise of some new and exciting applications. Ethereum's not the only one. There are others that are part of this group. And if you actually look at this graph, Ethereum, mostly Canadian, Aeon, mostly Canadian, Cosmos, mostly Canadian. So 3 of the leading platforms in the world are Canadian-based, and that, I think, reflects our leadership in this industry. So what's happened on these platforms like Ethereum is that new kinds of companies are issuing their own coins or tokens that are native to their application. So basically, the whole point of a utility token is that it'll have utility inside of an application. So a company like Golem, the G there on the screen, or something like Filecoin, which some of you might be familiar with, are basically technologies that distribute certain functions of the internet, like computing and storage. So Amazon Web Services is the biggest cloud computing company in the world inside of Amazon. And basically, when you're using Amazon Web Services or using the cloud, you're not actually using a cloud in the sort of amorphous sense. You're really just using their servers, right? So it turns out there's more compute power in all of the smartphones and all of the laptops and all the other devices in the world, but we just don't have a way to harness them to do coordinated computing. So what if there was an incentive? So Golem and Filecoin and these kinds of projects basically have a native token to their app that you can earn for using your device or putting your device into the network as a shared resource. And then if you want to use their service, then you have to pay back in with that token. So it creates an economy for a kind of computing resource. In this case, it's storage or processing power. The idea basically is that if these kinds of projects work, and this is one type of token of many, you could end up with a new internet, a new infrastructure that would challenge big companies like Amazon, for example. Skip that. Now, most projects who've raised money, if you guys are investors, you've probably seen an email come across your computer saying, new token sale, new ICO for some company or project. Most of those projects say they're doing a utility token, meaning their token has, it's useful. Most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, I think, a lot of projects were trying to raise money by issuing some kind of form of equity, basically, a type of security, except there wasn't a means to do it using the blockchain, so they created a utility token. But the next frontier in this technology is using blockchain to transform securities markets. So the value of crypto assets today is $200 billion. Not insignificant, bigger than the market cap of RBC, right? Canada's biggest company. But compared to literally any other market, like say the equity market globally, which is $110 trillion in size, it's a very small amount. Except the underlying, what makes this so potent for these kinds of applications could also apply and will, I think, also apply to securities, which is basically instead of settling T+2 or T+3 and having custodians and brokers and clearinghouses and agents and exchanges, it would settle T+0 peer-to-peer. So you can imagine if you're an investor or you're a fund manager or you're in the financial services market, all of a sudden you can basically transact in financial assets instantly and at zero cost. Think about what that would do to the financial markets. And this can apply to any kind of asset. It works specifically and particularly well for things like equities and to a lesser extent bonds. And the reason for that is that an equity, a stock, is just an invention of the human mind. It is a contract. It entitles you to a share of a company and some of its cash flow if it pays dividends, right? There is no underlying asset. There's no barrel of oil or bar of gold or any kind of physical commodity. So all of the contracting logic of a equity can become a smart contract and become a token. The next kind are natural asset tokens. Now these are a little bit different, right? So this is where we're talking about using blockchain to simplify the clearing and settlement of assets, but where there's still the physical delivery. You can't actually digitize a pork belly, right? Someone still needs to actually deliver that physical thing. So with these kinds of use cases, you can simplify and improve the way the world works, but you can't fix for the underlying delivery. So there's still some counterparty risk. There's still some intermediary risk as well. But what's more interesting about this is what it means for new kinds of asset classes. So like things like carbon markets, for example. Could you create a retail carbon market where people could earn and spend carbon credits dynamically rather than it being something that basically only governments and companies do and in a market that basically works by appointment only? Could you create a more liquid market by using this technology? The sixth kind are crypto collectibles. Who's heard of a thing called crypto kitties? Raise your hand. That's pretty good, audience. Who owns one? No? Maybe they're too embarrassed. So a crypto kitty is a completely unique, collectible digital asset. There's only one of any crypto kitty, in the same way that there's only one of any given like Picasso or Renoir or something like that. I'm not comparing the two in terms of their artistic significance. I'm just saying that they're unique in that way. And it turns out that people are willing to spend a lot of money on these things. So the most expensive CryptoKitty ever sold went for, anybody know? $100,000 US. So why would anyone spend $100,000 on a CryptoKitty other than having like an unhealthy love of cats and maybe too much money? Basically, the reason is that they can trust with 100% certainty that when they own this specific CryptoKitty, it's the only one of its kind. And someone can't make a copy of it and sell the same one to someone else. It is a completely unique digital asset. So you might think, well, this is a silly and fun thing, but what does it matter? Well, it turns out that there are actually tons of assets in our economy that are completely unique assets, both digital virtual assets as well as physical assets. So virtual assets, you're going to hear about e-gaming. So one of the biggest, fastest growing markets in the world are for in-game purchases. So a lot of games are pay to play. You buy certain assets inside of a game, like weapons or coins or something like that. And those kinds of assets are unique to those gaming ecosystems, right? So you can't move an asset from Fortnite into World of Warcraft. But in the future, there will be, if anyone's ever seen Ready Player One, this movie or read the book, sort of a similar idea where you basically have a metaverse where you can transport virtual assets of real value between different gaming ecosystems and you can own them. So if the gaming company goes belly up, the $50 or $100 you spent on those assets doesn't just disappear, you can transport them into other kinds of universes. And of course we can use this kind of collectible technology to apply to real assets in the real world. So the physical art market, for example, is about $60 billion in size, and there are companies like Codex and Artillery and others that are applying this tech to the art world. The final category are crypto fiat currencies and things called stable coins. So basically, like a stable coin is meant to maintain stable value over time, priced in some other asset, so like the US dollar. So one tether today is going to be worth one tether tomorrow. This is a type of stablecoin. And there's others that are emerging as well. I'm kind of skeptical on this because basically what it does is it creates counterparty and intermediary risk. So you've got this coin which you can spend and it's super easy, but in the end, it's got to be redeemable into some asset. And so whoever holds those assets holds the risk. So I think a more interesting opportunity is for crypto fiat currencies, which are basically cryptocurrencies issued, controlled by central banks. And I think that eventually we'll see most currencies in the world built on this technology. The early movers have been, oddly enough, countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, and others who I think are looking at this not because of how it could, broaden the access to finance or make the economy work better, because they're doing it because they're more interested in how it could help them avoid sanctions imposed by the US government. Because right now, basically, the US dollar system globally requires you to clear and settle through US banks. So if you can't do that, you need to come up with another option. So that's 7 types of crypto assets, which is one category of financial services, which is one industry that will be transformed by this technology. And if you look at what else it could do, it's actually quite interesting, right? So I'm not going to go through all 8 of these, but I want to cover just a couple of them. So the first one is this thing called the blockchain cooperative. So we know about companies like Uber and Airbnb and Lyft, right? These companies are part of the so-called sharing economy, and it's a nice notion. It's a really nice notion, this idea that we all get together and sing kumbaya and share in the value we create. But it's actually fundamentally untrue. Companies like Uber are not successful because they share. They're successful because they don't share. They aggregate excess capacity in an economy, so drivers, fares, cars, rooms in people's homes, skills, into a centralized intermediary and resell it. And if they can get in a monopoly in that given market, all the better. So sure, drivers get paid, kind of, on Uber, but the $65 billion of value that Uber's created is not shared by those who add the value, it's aggregated by a small group of stakeholders. There's no moral judgment here one way or the other. Uber is a business that has grown incredibly quickly. I just think it's dishonest intellectually to call it a sharing economy company. So kind of ask yourself, what are the things that Uber does? I think Uber basically does 4 things. It does identity, reputation, contracting, and payments. So identity, who's the driver, where is he, what kind of cars he got, how far away is he? Reputation, what's his star rating, how many hours has he driven, what's he well known for, etc. Contracting, when you get in an Uber, you get taken where you go, you pay, Uber's enforcing that agreement. And payments, built into the back end, are direct debit, Visa, MasterCard, whatever. All 4 of those different functions of what Uber does, I think, can be simplified using this technology. Contracting and payments, so we can use smart contracts to basically program self-executing agreements. So I need a car, I need it to be big so it fits 7 people, and I need to take a toll road because I'm late for hockey practice, and there needs to be room for our bags. All of those terms can be put into an agreement. You're not typing it in manually, it's just something that you can sign up for, right? And there's certain companies out there. Today, there's one called Velocia, which is also based in Toronto, that is doing this right now. It's got a pilot with the city of Mexico City in Mexico, and a couple of other places in Latin America, where it's basically using a blockchain-based platform to create a ride-sharing application. On identity and reputation, the 2 other factors, that's where we get into an interesting discussion about the way identity basically works. So today, data, and I don't think this is controversial, data is the most important asset class of the digital economy. So in the agrarian age, land was the most important asset class. All the wealthiest people were landowners. And in the industrial age, the most important assets were oil and industrial plant and equipment, which is why industrialists and oil barons were the most wealthy people in the world, right? Today, data is the most important asset class. And in the same way that oil drillers frack for oil, unlocking huge resources of energy and pulling it out of the ground, big companies like Facebook and Google and others frack data. There's all these huge pools of data that are trapped on the internet. And what they do is they put huge resources to work, huge computing power to work, to open up that data and to pull all the value out. And the way it works today is it's kind of a form of digital feudalism, where if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. I'm sure you've heard that before. And you're accessing all of these free services, and you're handing over all this information about yourself, and at the end of the day, you get to keep a little bit of value. I think the way things should work and the way we're inevitably going is to a model of citizen-centric data, where the virtual you isn't owned by Facebook and Google and Uber and Equifax and your bank and your government and everyone else. It's held and controlled by you. So if you want to do something online, you're deciding how much data you want to share. So if you want to buy something on the internet, it's not necessary most of the time that the merchant knows who you are. They just need to know you've got the money. You know, when I went to Starbucks, they didn't ask me for my driver's license because I paid in cash. Except every time we buy something online, we're divulging all this information about ourselves. Except when you want to do something else online, like, I don't know, get access to a loan from a bank to buy a house, then of course you do have to share more information about yourself. They need to know a little bit about your, past history, your income, your reputation, your credit history, et cetera. But it's up to you to provide informed consent. And I think this is really urgently needed today. And again, I really encourage you to stick around for the afternoon session with Chris, because I think he'll be discussing a lot of the ways in which this data, this concentration of data on the internet has become deeply problematic, not just for individuals, but for institutions like democracy. So one of the two companies that I started in the past couple of years is a group called the Blockchain Research Institute. The Blockchain Research Institute is basically the largest and most well-funded blockchain think tank in the world. So we are conducting dozens of different projects looking at how blockchain is going to change everything from specific industries like media, manufacturing, and healthcare, public service, technology, et cetera, to how it's going to change the role of leaders in organizations. What does this mean for the chief information officer, for the head of sales, for the head of HR, for the CTO, et cetera. And what's really fascinating about our membership is just how broad and diverse it is. So we have, as members of this institute, many of Canada's leading corporations, but also, obviously a very global group as well. And importantly, a group that represents many different types of industries. And there are industries like supply chains that could be transformed by this technology. And that's why companies like FedEx are so excited to be partnered with us. So I'll end on this. There's an old parable about the invention of chess, and it goes sort of something like this. The king in the land is so pleased with this invention that he offers the inventor anything he wants, whatever his heart desires, as a reward. And the inventor says, "Oh, sire, I am a humble man with humble needs. All I want is some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second, 4 grains on the third, and so on and so forth." And the king, who I gather is not a math guy, basically says, "Sure, whatever, your wish is granted. How much rice could that be? A barrel of rice, a bag? What a humble request from a humble guy." Of course, 4 becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, and so on and so forth. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the whole kingdom can produce in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the whole planet in 6 feet of rice. So that's sort of the power of exponential growth. By the way, as a quick aside, the inventor in chess for this little ruse ends up getting his head chopped off. This is not going to happen to you for embracing blockchain, I hope. So I think the first half of the chessboard is like the first digital age. It's the period from the 1940s till today, this past 70 years, where the world has become virtually unrecognizable. And I think that the next 70 years is going to be the second half of the chessboard. So things are going to double constantly over time, and that rate of growth is going to have some pretty disruptive consequences, but is also going to create some amazing opportunities. So all I can say is thank you very much for your time, and join the blockchain revolution. Thank you very much.